I'm Jonah Cohen, Camera's Communications Director. I see there's a large audience this afternoon for our first Meet the Author program. About 1,000 people signed up. We're excited you're here, very excited. Some of you are probably new to Camera. Others have been with us for decades and receive our emails, our informational emails, our literature. And so some of you know that since the pandemic, our staff has actually been busier than ever. One of the many unfortunate side effects of the virus has been a whole new array of falsehoods and conspiracies about Israel and Judaism and Jews. Our staff in the US, in the UK, in Israel, in Spain, in Latin America, our teams that work in the Arabic media markets, they're all facing this. All of them are countering these new falsehoods, needing to publish factual rebuttals and exposés, working hard to educate millions of news consumers. And editors, even editors, last month, in fact, we elicited 27 corrections from major media outlets, which is actually a record month for us. So we've been quite busy. But besides this upsurge in virus-related falsehoods, there are still the old media questions we traditionally deal with. Those haven't gone away. For instance, just the other day, Camera staff were in dialogue with editors at the Wall Street Journal, and the question came up, you know, how should the West Bank be designated in reports about the conflict? Our contention is that the term disputed territory is the most objective or politically neutral terminology, not privileging anybody. And we were able to convince the journal editors to concur with us and to issue a significant correction, making clear that this term is the most accurate or unbiased form of language that should be used when reporting about the conflict over the West Bank. Now, these kinds of corrections really do matter. They impact public perception. They impact future media reports, they impact the public debate, and ultimately public policy. And we owe a lot to you, especially to those of you who help us by responding to Camera's alerts and writing to editors. In many ways, our staff are able to impact the media environment in the effective way that they do because you're behind us. Thousands of volunteers making phone calls, writing letters, who take the time to answer the call of Camera's alerts and emails. A few days ago, in fact, there were two very eloquent letters in the LA Times, both by Camera letter writers. And that's actually quite typical. Many of the letters you see advocating for fair coverage of Israel in the major newspapers are written by volunteers in our media response team. So it's really a team effort. Our campus department, meanwhile, has also been extremely busy in these pandemic times, producing webinars, getting ready for summer training conferences, writing articles, making videos, and importantly, perhaps most importantly, recording and recruiting campus fellows, students who will bravely speak up for Israel on their campuses in the fall. So thanks to all of you who support this vital work that makes it all possible. Now, many of our loyal supporters have logged on today, and I think I know why. You're here for a terrific author, a brilliant author on a compelling subject. Let me just briefly say something about the format. It will include first our guest's presentation for about 25 minutes, and then Q&A with written questions. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for Q&A. Please submit your questions during the talk by clicking on that icon. We want to hear from you. Overtly political questions we might not dive into, but we do want to hear from you, so we'll take as many as we can afterwards. Now about our distinguished guest, Dr. Kenneth Levin. He earned an undergraduate degree in mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania, both a bachelor's and master's degree in English language and literature from Oxford University, an MD degree from Penn, and a PhD from Princeton. His PhD, I recently learned, was written under the supervision of the great, maybe the greatest historian of science, Thomas Kuhn. Dr. Levin then went on to become a member of the psychiatric faculty at Harvard Medical School for 4 decades. He taught at various psychoanalytic institutes in Boston and still maintains a private practice in psychiatry. On top of all that, he's written extensively on Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict for the media. His book, The Oslo Syndrome, Delusions of a People Under Siege, which he'll be discussing today, was initially published in 2005. A Hebrew version was published in 2013. Given his broad and deep academic background, I think perhaps only Dr. Levin could have written The Oslo Syndrome. Nobody else writing on Israel today combines his deep knowledge of psychology with the history of ideas. Moreover, his academic background in English language and literature makes his prose just a joy to read. His book is, I believe, a classic work on Jewish history. So it's really a delight for me personally to now welcome Dr. Levin.
Thank you very much, Jonah, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. The paragraph that was sent along with the invitation to this webinar noted that it is fairly common these days to see Jews joining with Israel's enemies, making common cause with those who seek to undermine the Jewish state's well-being and even its existence. The phenomenon of Jews actively engaging in positions that are inimical to the Jewish communities, to Jewish institutions, is a recurrent one throughout the history of the diaspora and throughout the history of Israel as well. I will be talking about this in the context of Oslo. Now, the Oslo peace agreements, as they were characterized, were intended to bring about finally genuine peace between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and the Arab world more broadly. Instead, they led to the worst terror that Israel had ever encountered. How much was this predictable? Well, I would argue, and many others would argue, that if you look at what the other side, what Arafat and those around him, or other Palestinian interlocutors with the Israelis pursuing peace, were saying and doing in the months and weeks leading up to Oslo, it was obvious that these were not peace partners. To give one example, on the very night of the famous handshake on the White House lawn in September of 1993, Arafat was on Jordanian television explaining to his Palestinian constituency and to the Arab world more broadly that they should understand Oslo in terms of the 1974 Palestinian Declaration. This was a reference to what is called the Plan of Phases. That is, the PLO, the Palestinians declared then that they would take whatever territory they can get by negotiations and use that as a base from which to pursue Israel's annihilation. So this was his explanation of Oslo. He repeated it weeks before the September 1993 ceremonies and the following weeks. He also referred to Oslo as comparable to the Peace of Hudaybiyah, which Muhammad had signed in 628 with his major adversaries, and then 2 years later, when his forces were stronger, he unilaterally abrogated the agreements and overran those adversaries. He also continued to call for jihad. Now, it was not just Arafat doing all of this, it was his associates, and once he entered the territories and came to Gaza, he got control of media outlets, of Palestinian schools, of Palestinian mosques, and those messages were broadcast from those outlets, schools, mosques as well. Israel did nothing in response to that. Occasionally, when there was enough of a public outcry, it may say, oh, you ought to stop or tone it down. Basically, it did nothing. The nation did nothing. At the same time, there was increased terror. From the time that Arafat arrived in Gaza in July of 1994 until the fall of the Labor Meretz government that had choreographed Oslo in May of 1996, there were over 150 Israelis killed in terror attacks. That is a rate of terror 2.5 times higher than throughout the years from 67 until 93 and the start of Oslo. Again, the Israeli government did nothing to put the brakes on Oslo. In fact, to indicate how diluted the response was, Yossi Sarid, who was then head of Meretz, stated that the proper response to the increase in terror was for Israel to make more concessions to Arafat, more territorial concessions more quickly. The logic to this? Well, again, the claim by the Israelis was it's really Islamic groups, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, are responsible for terror. Now, they were responsible for a lot of terror, but the Israeli government was very aware of Arafat's collusion with them in the terror. And of course, Arafat openly praised much of the terror. So Sarid argued, no, the reason why Arafat isn't doing anything to stop the Islamist groups is because he hasn't received enough concessions to give him enough gravitas with the population so that the population would follow him in clamping down. And if Israel gave him more quickly, then he would have be more able to rally his constituents in an effort to clamp down on the Islamist terrorists. Totally diluted, but this was what was going on in Israel. And the losses to terror were characterized during this period as sacrifices for peace. Now, why? Why did Israel embark on this course and maintain it through the incitement, through the terror? It's interesting to listen to people who were enthusiasts for Oslo and then took a step back from it. Nissam Tzvili, for example, was a labor member of the Knesset at this time. He was on the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee of the Knesset, and he wrote years later in 2002, I remember myself lecturing in Paris and saying that Arafat's double talk had to be understood. That was our thesis, proved later as nonsense. Arafat meant every word and we were naive. So his explanation is naivety. Well, I don't think that gets you very far. If you think about people like Rabin and Peres, whatever adjectives you might apply to them, good, bad, indifferent, naive is not high among them. A more interesting response, or mea culpa in a sense, came from Ari Shavit, as you know, a senior Haaretz columnist, who writing in 1997, and Shavit again was an enthusiastic supporter of Oslo initially, and saw himself as joining with the other elites in Israel, not just the journalist elites, but also the academic elites, the cultural elites, in backing Oslo. And he wrote in 97, in the early 90s, we, the enlightened Israelis, were infected with a messianic craze. All of a sudden, we believed that the end of the old Middle East was near. The end of history, the end of wars, the end of conflict. We fooled ourselves with illusions. We were bedazzled into committing a collective act of messianic drunkenness. Well, messianic drunkenness is an interesting term. It vividly captures in some respects what was going on at the time, but it's not an explanation. I argue in my book that the explanation lies in the psychology of chronically besieged populations. Whether one is talking about minorities that are marginalized, defamed, denigrated, perhaps attacked by the surrounding majority, or small states under chronic siege by their neighbors, invariably, almost invariably, elements of those populations will embrace the indictments, however absurd, however bigoted, of their besiegers, and seek to reform, take them to heart, believe them essentially, and seek to reform their community in order to appease the attackers. Now, I say seek to reform. Not everyone will do that. There are others who take it to heart and simply seek to desert the community. if they're Jews and in the diaspora, they may convert and just immerse themselves in the wider population, or they may even, to more definitively separate themselves from the taint of being Jewish, they will join the attackers. Again, a phenomenon that we see a fair amount of today. Many will stay within the community, though, but again, they will seek to reform it. And this psychological corrosiveness of besiegement, again, has been a factor throughout the history of Israel and throughout the diaspora. And it affects other minorities in similar positions or other small states as well. Now, one factor significant in this regard is that it's gotten worse in the last few centuries, and I'll explain briefly why in a moment. But I want to refer initially to the paradigm on individual psychology that I believe best suits this phenomenon, and that is the psychology of chronically abused children. Whether one is talking about children that are abused vis-a-vis, well, if you're talking about chronic abuse, you're typically talking about parents. Whether one is talking about neglected children or actively abused children, such children almost invariably blame themselves. They say, I am being treated this way because I am bad, and if I become good, then I'll be treated better. If one talks to therapists who treat such children, whether psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, one will hear that this is in fact a recurrent, common, very common phenomenon, typical phenomenon. What's the explanation for it? The most common explanation given in the literature tends to be that children are naive, and that the abusing parents, and again, it's typically parents who are talking about chronic abuse, convey to the child the message that he or she is bad, and in his or her naivety, he just embraces that as reality. I think a more basic explanation lies in the existential predicament, one might call the existential predicament of such children. In a sense, they could either look at their situation realistically, and children typically know when they're being abused. They could either accept that a child, there's nothing I can do about it. These parents control my life. These people control my life. I'm a victim, and I'm helpless, and my situation is hopeless. Or they can say, this is happening because I'm bad, and if I reform and become good, then the abuse will end. And endure the self-deprecation that goes along with seeing oneself as bad, but at the same time maintain the fantasy that I can improve things by my own actions. If I only change my behavior, then the abuse will end. And children at all costs avoid hopelessness, and adults tend to do the same. Now, children are not necessarily entirely helpless in this situation, because if they're fortunate enough to have another adult in their lives, say a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, who conveys a different message to them, a message that I may not be able to extricate you from your current situation or do much to ameliorate it, but I can assure you there's nothing wrong with you. You're the victim of this. Eventually you'll be removed from the situation, and you'll be okay. Your life will go forward and you'll be okay, and you have to believe in yourself. And again, in those situations, such adult supporters, again, not being able to extricate them, the children, from their situation, can nevertheless play a very positive role in the children's lives and prevent them from growing up with the same self-deprecating sense of themselves and go into adulthood still perceiving themselves as tainted, still seeking to appease people who don't treat them well, and tend to live miserable lives. In the context of abused or besieged populations, the same role can be played by communal institutions. If they have enough gravitas within the population and convey a different message. Okay, we're living under difficult circumstances now, but it's not our fault. We're not bad. It's our abusers, our attackers, the haters that are bad, and eventually we'll extricate ourselves and have a better future. Then that too could help mitigate the corrosive impact of besiegement. For various reasons having to do with the history of the emergence of modern nation states, say starting in the mid-18th century, some a little earlier, some later, the Jewish institutions were dramatically weakened, and Jews, as a result, were left much more vulnerable to this corrosive impact of attacks. So much so that, for example, in the late 1800s, the Austrian Jewish writer, an early Zionist, Max Nordau, said, "The greatest success of the anti-Semites is they've gotten the Jews to see themselves through anti-Semitic eyes." He could have added to that, he could have amplified that to say, yes, that's true. Jewish self-hatred was a real phenomenon. And he began at that time to get a literature on Jewish self-hatred. But it's also the case that for many, they would accept the indictments of the haters, of the anti-Semites, but say or see other Jews, particularly Jews across political, social, religious divides, as the true objects of anti-Semitism. So you'd have German Jews saying it's the Eastern European Jews that fit the stereotypes. Or you have socialist Jews saying that about the Jewish bourgeoisie, or secular Jews saying about the religious Jews, traditionally religious Jews. This phenomenon had tremendous impact on European Jews. It also had impact on the early Zionist movement. If one thinks about Russian socialist Zionists, and they dominated the Zionist movement through all the years of the issue, the Jewish community in the mandate, throughout the years of the mandate, and they controlled the Israeli government for the first 3 decades of the state. And they too, there was an impact of this assault on the Jews on Russian socialist Zionist thinking. The Russian socialists in general, Russian Jewish socialists, even those who were not Zionists, members of the Bund, also embraced some of the concepts of the anti-Semites, particularly if one looks at, say, in Middle and Central Europe, when the issue of giving civic rights to Jews first emerged in the early 19th century, and the anti-Semites would say things like, "Oh no, the Jews are degenerate people, and proof of that is they speak a degenerate language, Yiddish." Or they'd say, "The Jews are a degenerate people, and the fact that they're engaged in trade overwhelmingly and are not farmers and craftspeople is a sign of their degeneracy." And there were Jews who embraced this and said, even Jews dedicated to the Jewish community would say, yes, we have to give up Yiddish and speak normative German, and then we'll be accepted. It was wishful thinking that that was the basis of anti-Semitism. They could fix it by just changing the language they spoke. But essentially, they embraced the indictment. Or they said, yes, Jews, we're not fit for civic rights until we give up our overwhelming engagement in trade and return to being farmers and craftspeople. Well, in fact, many Jews in Eastern Europe were farmers and craftspeople. In fact, a lot of the crafts were dominated by Jews in Eastern Europe, all the way up to the Holocaust. But they just ignored that. They just were so eager to take the cues from the anti-Semites and try to reform to placate them. And among the in the socialist Zionist groups and the socialist non-Zionist groups among Jews in Eastern Europe, they decided what they took from the anti-Semites was it was particularly the bourgeois Jews and the religious Jews that were the targets of anti-Semitism. And so if Jews became more secular and more socialist, that would be steps against the anti-Semites, steps to undermine the anti-Semites. And the way this affected the Zionist movement is Herzl, in his concept of Zionists, of the Jewish state, believed that if Jews had a state, they'd become a normal people and anti-Semitism would wither. The Russian Socialist Zionists had a different perspective. they said, no, it wouldn't be enough just to have a state, but it had to be a state based on socialist and secular principles. And then it was anti-Semitism would wither. And even the agrarian focus of the Zionist movement, the Russian social Zionist movement, was influenced by this notion that only agrarian activities were healthy, normal activities and would undermine anti-Semitism. So you can talk about focus on the kibbutz, focus on working the land. To some of the degree, it was biblically oriented. Obviously, biblical Israel and Judea were agrarian societies. It was also influenced by 19th century European Romanticism, which apotheosed, in the sense of the working of the land, but much of it was influenced again by this emphasis on, well, Jews weren't farmers and that made them degenerate. And early Zionists in Russia would talk about how we have to become like Russian peasants in order to be accepted. Well, in Israel, once we're talking about the Jews in Eretz Israel during the mandate or during the state itself, the years of the state itself, of course, then the chronic siege was not by European anti-Semites, it was by the surrounding Arab world. And many people responded in the same way. How do we placate the Arabs? And there were people who argued within the social Zionist community that, well, declaring a state would be hostile to the Arabs and we shouldn't do that. They were a minority. There were others who called for other concessions to the Arabs. And this continued throughout the years of the Yishuv, throughout the years, the early decades of the state. To some degree, such voices were marginalized by two major factors. One factor was that there was always hope that the siege would end for external reasons, not because the Jews would placate, would appease the attackers. And there was hope, for example, well, when the state was established, we're a fait accompli now, and so the hatred would end. They'd have to reconcile themselves to our existence. Of course, that didn't happen. And then it was, well, the British acted as agents provocateurs. They encouraged Arab hostility. When the British leave, things will get better. That didn't happen. Then it was, well, the conservative Arab leaders were responsible, and when they were replaced, things would get better. And there was enthusiasm for the colonel's revolution in Egypt in '52 that brought Nasser to power. People in Israel thinking that would improve things. Of course it did. Then in '67, well, they're going to want the land back, so they'll make peace with us in exchange for land. And instead you had, a few months after the war, Khartoum and the three no's of no recognition, no negotiations, no peace. That ate away at the hope for an external resolution of the attacks and buttressed those who wanted to somehow find a way to appease the Arabs. A bigger factor, though, that kept those views still marginalized, is that, again, those views tended to be on the extreme of the socialist Zionist thinking. But socialist Zionists were running the country. And many more in that camp identified with Ben Gurion and his associates and his successors than identified with these marginalized groups that were constantly criticizing the state for somehow appeasing the Arabs, doing the wrong thing vis-a-vis the Arab world. And that, however, changed dramatically in '77 with the election of the first non-socialist Zionist government, the election of Menachem Begin. And this was seen by the left in general in Israel, not just as an electoral defeat, but as, in a sense, the stealing of the country away from them. And again, if you think about these people, much of the camp as reared on the notion that what made Israel different and what was going to end anti-Jewish hatred was Israel's being a socialist secular state, was going to be Israel being based on what was called the new Jew, that is, a socialist secular Jew. The fact that it was the old Jew that is now in power, they thought was disastrous. And why were these the old Jews? Well, if the Likud, first of all, was created as a merger between the descendants of Jabotinsky's revisionist camp, and initially the Israeli Liberal Party, which was just a sort of standard European type liberal party, was capitalist, called for free trade, was against the socialist foundations of the state, but more economic than political. So they merged, and then a few small right-wing parties joined them. But their constituency was largely Sephardic, and the Sephardic community tended to be more traditional religiously and petty bourgeois, and the more religious and more middle class among the Ashkenazi. So this was the old Jew who's now taking control of the country. And over the next 15 years, from 77 to 92, Likud was either in control of the government or senior or equal partners in governments of national unity. And during those years, that extremist form that said, no, the Arab hostility is due to Jewish Israeli missteps, and we have to make concessions, and the way to peace is for Israel to concede and concede, that got greater traction with labor with the left being out of control of the government, no longer in control of the government. And the argument became, well, peace is not at hand, even though it was Begin, of course, who made peace with Egypt. That was just dismissed. Peace is not at hand because it is the old Jew controlling the country. And if we only win it back and make the proper concessions, then peace will be able to advance. In 92, labor wins. But it's indicative, but prior to that, in addition to that argument, there were other forces in the country that were working in the same direction. You had this new history in academia, largely a bogus history, as Ephraim Karsh said. What is new in the new history is not true, and what's true in the new history is not new. Essentially, tried to cast Israel as the party at fault, somehow in missteps, accused Israel, for example, of in the War of Independence having a plan to completely push Arabs out. No such plan existed. If you look at the literature, you can see how the literature is doctored to advance this argument by the new historians. It's bogus, but it became popular and it gained traction for those who were eager for peace and saw Israeli concessions as the path to peace. And the hopes of the new historians, where you're talking about Benny Morris or Avi Schleim or Ilan Pape or the others, and Tom Segev, the argument is, if we can convince Israelis that they've been remiss, that they've been at fault, then we can get them more prepared to make concessions. The same thing was happening in the cultural realm. You look at novels written in the 80s, early 90s, they're almost all take on anti-Zionist themes. You see the same in plays, you see the same in Israeli movies during this period, you see the same in the plastic arts during this period. And then you had a movement of post-Zionism that said essentially, well, it's the Jewish accoutrements of the state that offends Israel's neighbors. And so what we have to do is get rid of the law of return that allows Jews to come to Israel and get automatic citizenship. And we have to get rid of Hatikva, it's too Jewish, and we have to get rid of the flag. And those will be steps towards gaining Israel acceptance. So this is the background. And 92, labor wins. Rabin ran in 92 on a typical traditional platform of about this version of the territories, what he saw as a way of treating the territories that would lead to peace. And in particular, in the wake of the First Intifada, he argued that most of the Palestinian so-called leaders are terror leaders, terror organizations. Some people in the territory had gotten some leadership kudos on the basis of their activities during the Intifada, and were not terrorists. And so he was calling for the UN to supervise elections for new leaders in the territories, and Israel would then negotiate with them. But at the same time as he was saying this, there were people from Peace Now, thousands of people demonstrating outside his offices saying, no, you have to talk with Arafat. Arafat is the only bona fide leader of the Palestinians. You have to negotiate with them. And obviously, he ultimately capitulated. Now, when I talk of the terror that was there in the first years of Oslo, it had only a limited impact. It didn't have an impact on the policies of the government. Within the population, you saw by latter part of 94, 95, polls of opinion suggested in a new election that that Likud would narrowly beat Labor, that Netanyahu would narrowly beat Rabin. Of course, Rabin is assassinated towards the end of 95. There's a great shift in opinion, sympathy in the wake of the assassination towards Labor, and to capitalize on that sympathy, Labor Meretz coalition advanced the elections from November of 96 to May. Nevertheless, with the terror ongoing, Netanyahu won a narrow victory. But it didn't signify any great change in the Israeli population. On the contrary, a few years later, in 93, Ehud Barak becomes prime minister and immediately pursues this final agreement and gets Clinton to sponsor it and to host it in Camp David. At the agreement, Barak makes concessions beyond anything that any Israeli had considered before then. Arafat says no. Clinton adds to the concessions. Arafat again says no. Arafat offers no counter concessions. Instead, he goes out and shortly thereafter launches his terror war, which in the subsequent several years kills over 1,000 Israelis, horribly maims many, many more. And at this point, opinion in Israel does shift dramatically against the Oslo mentality. And for those who still embraced Oslo, the consequences of the sequelae that followed on the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza converted a lot of them to a very different position. So Israeli opinion changed in the context of much loss of blood and really horrible circumstances. And it remains a question, though, of what would happen if there's some quiet again in Israel, but Israel remains under siege. Could they revert to the same kind of thinking as, again, one sees within Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, throughout the history of Israel, and also in other minorities as well? Perhaps I'll stop at that point and take questions, and we can go from there. Thank you.
We have one here that says, the Oslo syndrome sounds like the Stockholm syndrome, where one adopts the views of the adversary. Is that part of your reason for naming it the Oslo syndrome?
That was the entire reason. It was just a play on the Scandinavian capitals. And yes, the Stockholm syndrome, everybody's heard the term. It had to do with a bank robbery in the capital, in the Swedish capital, that went awry with the perpetrators and several of the hostages being locked into a vault, a bank vault, for a number of days. And when they were finally freed, they emerged with the hostages demonstrating a lot of sympathy for the bank robbers. And that's where the name comes from. And in psychiatric terms, Anna Freud had coined the term and described what the phenomena to which she applied the term is identification with the aggressor, and in the sense of both concepts. But she thought it come from that. But she thought identification with the aggressor, as she used it, applied to all children. And I think it's my Oslo syndrome particularly applies to children subjected to chronic abuse.
All right, so we have a question here wondering how the Oslo syndrome applies to American Jews who are presently acting the same towards Israel as Israelis did during Oslo. So does it have application to the American Jewish community?
Well, I think it does, and in one respect, one might have anticipated in the wake of the course of Oslo some split between Israelis and American Jews in the sense that uh, the result of the terror and the result of the horrible experience of Oslo has pushed the Jewish population in Israel somewhat to the right. At least their focus now is on security, and they do not see Palestinian partners for potential peace under current circumstances. And they've voted for right of center parties consistently since 2000, pretty much since 2000. And American Jewish population is largely left of center in its politics, so you might have expected some split. In fact, there are a lot of polls of American Jewish opinion don't reflect such a split, but you see it among American elites. And I'd like to say something about elites. And as I mentioned, it was the elites largely who pushed the Oslo to begin with. That Ari Shavi is seeing himself among the elites and talks about the other elites. And in some sense, Oslo was a failure of Israel's elites, the political elite, the academic elite, the journalist elite, the cultural elite. They did not defend the society against the corrosive impact of the siege. Instead, they led the way to seeking to appease the attackers in ways that were inimical to the state. Now, in some ways, you can see the same thing in among elites in America. Well, first of all, there's a question. If you talk about American Jews, one might and communities being under siege, you say, well, wait a second. You might question it because, after all polls of American opinion generally, not of Jewish opinion, show high levels of support for Israel. Now, you may see greater support for Palestinians increasing somewhat, but still, Americans are overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. You see this in Gallup polls, you see it in other polls. So why would the Jewish community feel somehow besieged vis-a-vis support of Israel? Well, I think the answer to that is it's not Americans in general with whom many American Jews identify. It's groups, they identify more with elite American groups that have become more hostile to Israel. You look at academia, particularly academia. You look at some political changes in the parties. You look at the media, to some elements of the media. And it is with these groups that much of American Jewish elites at least identify. And as they've grown, those groups have grown more hostile to Israel. Those elites, and even the elite, as has been pointed out by others, even the elite Protestant denominations are hostile to Israel. And they're groups in America that are eager to pursue interreligious faith dialogue with those groups, dismiss the Protestant groups that are supportive of Israel, are more interested in those elite groups, and are influenced by those groups' hostility to Israel. And with regard to this, I'd like to mention two items that appeared in the news in early February this year. One was a poll of American Jewish opinion by the Rudman Family Foundation, was published in Israel National News on February 4th of this year, and showed that 80% of American Jews were pro-Israel, 67% felt personal attachment to Israel. That what happened to Israel had an impact on them. And that's fairly suggests that there isn't much support for Israel still in the American Jewish community. The next day in Jerusalem Post, there was an article by Gil Troy, who's an academic in Toronto. And he says, the title was, "Are Rabbinical Schools Becoming Anti-Israel Pulpits?" And I'll give you this quote. It's a long quote, but I think it's worth being aware of. In 2011, when Rabbi Daniel Gordis highlighted, quotes, how lonely it can be for an unapologetically pro-Israel student in some of today's rabbinical schools, unquote, his conservative and reform colleagues excoriated him for exaggerating. Today, his criticisms seem mild. Things are far worse. Every year, I hear from non-Orthodox rabbinical students that, in their programs, the once marginal anti-Israel voices, while not the majority, have gone aggressively mainstream, often bullying Zionist students and speakers. So here you have a Jewish elite which has taken a position against Israel, certainly not sympathetic to Israel. And part of it has to do with who do they identify with in the wider society. I'll stop there, but there's a lot to be said on this.
Yeah, I'm wondering where is the line drawn between just sort of a healthy self-criticism and then when people start identifying with abusive interpretations of Israel and Judaism, where do we draw that line?
Well, if one could criticize Israeli policies. I don't endorse every Israeli policy, but you can still be supportive of the state. Your criticism can, in the context of wanting to make the state better without its compromising its security. When you're joining with groups that are really hostile to Israel, when you're joining with groups that have terrorist connections, when you're joining with groups that seek the dissolution of the state, then that's crossed the line. And it's a related question, one might say, is what's the question between trying to accommodate potential critics of Israel or of the Jewish community in order to be more accepted versus appeasing enemies. I mean, if I talked about, for example, when anti-Semites were claiming that Jews are a degenerate people and speaking Yiddish is a sign of their degeneracy, and so an illustration of why they're unfit for civic rights. Now, one could argue that encouraging Jews to speak normative German in these German states, again, there were many German states in the early part of the 19th century, it's way before German unification, but among those states, and there were relatively few that were prepared to extend civic rights to Jews, that Jews speaking normative German might have been a path to get more greater acceptance. But that was different from endorsing this notion that something is degenerate about Yiddish and that it contributes to the degeneracy of the Jews. And if you reform the language they speak, you'll get accepted. This was wishful thinking. This would be a solution to the anti-Semitic problem of anti-Semitism. It was delusional. And so you could say, you can concede things and say, yes, we could do things to be more accepted. Another example, in the small Prussian community, the small Jewish community in Prussia in the early part of the 19th century was under a lot of duress. And then Napoleon came along, and the Prussians are fighting Napoleon, and the two leaders of the Jewish community in Berlin urged young Jews, a very small community, to sign up and in the fight and say, well, if you join in the fight for the fatherland, then and spill blood as their blood is, others' blood is spilled, they can't help but acknowledge you as equal citizens. They can't help but extend the rights to you as Jews because you fought with them on the battlefield. Well, in fact, Jews did sign up. A disproportionate number of Jews were honored for their battlefield performance. A disproportionate number of Jews died, for example, at Waterloo. And yet, after the war, there was a huge anti-Semitic backlash. It had nothing to do with anything the Jews did. It had to do with Prussia and other German states rebelling against the French notion, the French revolutionary notion of social contract and citizenship being based on social contract, and wanting to revert to blood and blood links being the source of national identity. And of course, the Jews were losers there. And so this wishful thinking that if we just do the same right thing, we'll be accepted, was again delusional.
We have some more questions about the American Jewish situation. So it seems like on the one hand, anti-Semitism is, the polls say it's very low in the United States. On the other hand, FBI statistics show that Jews are the chief target of religious hate crimes. So where does the concept of besiegement fall in terms of the American Jewish experience?
Well, as I said earlier, and on the one hand, vis-a-vis Israel, it's hard to say that Israel's besieged or the Jewish community is besieged for support of Israel in America, because most Americans support Israel. The problem is that many Americans, again, American Jews, particularly the elites, the elements of the wider society which they identify tend to be those, particularly academia, that are most critical of Israel. Look, where do you see anti-Semitism most rife in this country in significant numbers? It's on the campuses. Where do you see attacks on Israel most rife? On the campuses, among the faculty and among the students. As others have pointed out, the level of anti-Semitism on the campuses sort of correlates with numbers of faculty that endorse BDS and actively engage in promoting BDS. So it's not the issue of being besieged in America, it's being besieged on those institutions in America with which much of the American elite Jewish community identifies.
Great. We have a question here. What is the solution to Jewish self-hatred, or maybe worse, the conclusion that there is no ability to become, quote unquote, unvictims and therefore accept their fate? Is this what occurred in World War II? So how do we deal with Jewish self-hatred?
Well, as I suggested, first of all, the major factor is education. If Jews are reared in situations where they're educated to believe in themselves, the value of Jewish identity, and believe in themselves as belonging to a community that is in so many ways so exceptional and so worthy of their loyalties, and offers them so much, is so rich for them in emotional, spiritual ways, other ways, then they will be more likely to want to remain a part of it and to want to fight the haters. The issue of Jewish self-hatred, for example, if you contrast where I would apply Jewish self-hatred versus Jewish anti-Semitism, Jewish anti-Semitism is, I think, most applicable to Jews who see other Jews as fitting anti-Semitic stereotypes, and they don't hate themselves so much as hating others. We see plenty of that around, plenty of that. But the issue of Jewish self-hatred, if you think of a child in school who is marginalized, attacked, ridiculed for being Jewish, and goes home and gets no counter message from his family, from his community to that, then he will think there's something tainted in me, something's wrong with me, qua Jew, and that's a problem. Theodore Lessing, who wrote the most prominent text on Jewish self-hatred in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, and most of the authors who wrote this literature, this early literature on Jewish self-hatred, were people who saw it in themselves and somehow became critical of it in themselves. And Lessing was certainly among them, and so he was a prolific writer and was attacked in his early writing for his hostility to other Jews. But he talked about, then he wrote an autobiographical text. I don't think it's ever been translated. It was essentially Once and Never Again was the title. And talked about how he was in school, in elementary school, and there were two Jews in his class, and they were sort of ridiculed by the class and attacked. One in particular, the other was the best student in the class, and that won him some kudos and some immunity. But the other one was, and at one point, Lessing himself called this other Jew a dirty Jew or something, and the kid said to him, "Well, you're Jewish too." And Lessing said, "No, I'm not." He went home and he asked his mother, "Are we Jewish?" And she didn't answer. She refused to answer. And then sometime later, they were walking the street. He and his mother were walking the street, and they see there's a Jew there with a kaftan with in Orthodox garb, and his mother said, "That's a Jew." They're suggesting that they weren't, and it was, this is how he grew up. So of course he's going to be subject to, again, even though much of later he tended to gear it towards others, but when he accepted who he was, initially he was shamed by it, and eventually realized, well, wait a second. As he educated himself a little more, he felt a lot better about it, and eventually he became an ardent Zionist. He wrote against them. He was alive when the Nazis came to power, wrote against them, had to flee, fled to Czechoslovakia, but the Nazis sent a few assassins and they killed him in Czechoslovakia, and then were rewarded the next day in Berlin for killing him.
Wow. Maybe related to that. So if you come across someone who has the Oslo syndrome, who's internalized these kind of narratives, how do you recommend approaching them and making them aware of it?
Well, look, as a psychiatrist, I know you can't talk people out of delusions, because there's an emotional investment in it, and unless you start addressing the emotional investment, it's hard to. I mean, you can present them. If it depends how superficial or how deep is their, commitment to this belief that Jews are wrong or Israel's wrong, and Israel is tainted and Israel is just evil and maybe shouldn't even exist. If somebody's committed to that, it's not something they're going to be able to address with arguments. I mean, if you look at the Oslo situation, again, most of these people, many of them who supported, were not anti-Israel. They were Israeli citizens, and they fought for Israel, but they were convinced that Israel was somehow at fault, and that conviction had to do for their desperate desire for peace and their belief that only concessions by Israel, that somehow they wanted to believe that Israel was at fault, and therefore Israel can take steps that would appease the Arabs. Of course, the truth is, if you look at the Middle East situation, the greatest force by far are the Arabs. They're 350 million plus against 7 million Jews. War or peace? Peace is going to be determined on the Arabs' timetable, not Israel. Israel hopefully remains strong enough to deter attacks, strong enough to defeat attacks when they do occur. It will never be strong enough to impose peace, either by military force or force of concessions or any means to impose peace on the Arabs. Peace will come if and when it comes on the Arabs' timetable. But the Israelis who refuse to reconcile themselves to that. Yossi Beilin said explicitly he refused to reconcile himself to that. And but the issue of delusions and trying to just reason people out of delusions, it doesn't happen. There's a story about I'm told among psychiatrists about the new psych resident who is called to the emergency room because somebody has come into the emergency room and announced that he's dead and wants to be taken to the morgue. And so they call the psychiatrist to meet with him, and he says to the psych resident, again, the naive psych resident, "I don't know why they have you seeing me. I'm dead. Just arrange for me to be taken to the morgue." And the psychiatrist is thinking, how could he convince, what rational means could he pursue to convince him the man he's not dead. So finally he says to him, and he has a pin because he does neurological tests too. He says, well, do dead people bleed? And I said, I said, why are you asking me questions like that? Of course dead people don't bleed. I said, well, would you mind if I prick your finger? And he said, I don't care, I'm dead, I'm not going to feel anything. So he pricks his finger and the man bleeds, and the man says, my God, dead people do bleed. You know, so, again, his investment was in believing he was dead. You're not going to rationally talk him out of it.
You convincingly make the argument that Israelis were hardened in the crucible of terror and were able to move away from identifying as victims. What will it take to convert diaspora Jews?
Well, that's a good question. Hopefully it won't require bloodletting to convert diaspora Jews. I think, again, the issue is education. Education. Now, there are, I think, family education, temple education, but that's compromise. You see who's coming out, what's being taught in the seminaries, that's often problematic. And the seminaries have ramifications for campuses. Of course, many of the leaders of Hillels, and some Hillels are great and some are very problematic, but their leaders are often rabbis coming out of these seminaries that are somewhat hostile to Zionism. But if you look at Jewish day schools, Jewish after schools, Jewish day camps, they often convey obviously they typically convey a pro-Israel message. I think it would be helpful if they also educated the students more in the nature of the conflict and what Israel faces and the anti-Israel arguments that they're going to encounter on college and how to deal with them. But education is the key. It's noteworthy in this regard of what happened to Israeli education in the context of Oslo. That the people, once that government, Labor Meretz government was elected, the people running the education ministry tried to introduce themes that downplayed Jewish history, downplayed Israel's history, downplayed Jewish religious themes, and tried to quote universalize the history courses as a way of, in a sense, as one writer noted, numbing Israeli youth to their connections with the state, and in that way preparing them to make major concessions.
Okay, what is your vision for the future?
Well, I think for the future, where I think that Israel in general is far removed from where it was in 92, 93. I think that the losses they suffered, the catastrophic losses they suffered, has woken them from the reveries of Oslo, as I've said, and I don't see them quickly slipping back into it, even though, again, the message they still get from many of their elites, from the cultural elites, the media elites, certainly in academia, on all Israel campuses, there's a counter message. The people just don't buy it. And so what will happen in the future is unclear, but I think, again, Israel is in a much better position than it was then. I think the American Jewish community needs education, needs to rethink some of its positions if they choose to. I mean, people are open to take whatever courses they want here, obviously.
Okay, how do you explain the anti-Israel professors, both in Israel and here and abroad?
Well, in Israel, I think if you talk about all the elite, it's interesting when I'm talking about elites. Thurgood Marshall, the first African American, obviously first African American member of the Supreme Court, wrote a concurring opinion to a Supreme Court case in '77, and in that opinion, he noted, interestingly, and I'm paraphrasing somewhat, he said, "It is well known among social scientists that the elites of minorities commonly embrace the wider society's biases against their own minority. Now, I'm sure that statement was informed by his experience as an African American. The case that he was addressing didn't involve either Jews or African Americans. It involved a third minority. But it's an interesting case, and it's consistent with much of what I've seen and what I've said, and part of the explanation lies in a sense, elites inevitably having in a sense dual loyalties, or what's called other loyalties, not dual loyalties in the sense of treason or dual loyalties in the sense of another nation, but to peer groups. And if a cab driver in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem doesn't really care about it, what a cab driver in New York or London might think of him. But if you're an academic at Tel Aviv University or Hebrew University and aspire to a visiting professorship in Europe or the United States, or even just being invited for an endowed lecture, to give an endowed lecture in Europe and the United States, you're not going to get that if you're too pro-Israel. And they want the approval of their peers, and they want the perks that come with the approval of their peers. And you could look at the other elites as well. If a playwright who wants his plays performed in New York or London, or an Israeli makes a film that hopes it will be accepted at Toronto or Venice Film Festival or Cannes, they're not going to do that with pro-Israel films. They're very much increase the likelihood of doing it with anti-Israel films. So that issue of pure acceptance has an impact on elites.
Well, I feel like we're just getting started, but unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. And I think we'll end on how can we wake up people who are oblivious or uninformed about the Oslo syndrome? How do we move forward?
Recommend the book. Is one way. I think it'd be nice if more were written on this theme. It'd be nice if, but the education is answer. The answer is education, education, education. People need, first of all, obviously, the basic thing, and is people having some conviction that Jewish identity is worthwhile. That to not give one's children the inheritance, the intellectual, spiritual inheritance that they deserve, that is their right by virtue of being born Jewish or becoming Jewish, and what Judaism has been, what Jewish communities have been over the course of the millennia, what it's offered to the world, what it's offered to other Jews, to not seeing that spiritual, intellectual heritage as worth conveying to children, I think is a great disservice to children. And the children who are imbued with it have a much greater capacity to resist. Not universal capacity to resist, but a much greater capacity to resist than those who are deprived of that sort of education.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Levin, for this thought-provoking talk. You've definitely given us a lot to think about. And thanks to all of you for joining us and asking so many probing questions. I apologize that I couldn't get to all of them. If you like today's conversation, we have more interesting Meet the Author talks coming up. On May 28th, in about a week, we'll be speaking with Lahav Harkov, the great diplomatic correspondent and senior editor for the Jerusalem Post. Anyone interested in knowing more about this talk can email tracy@camera.org. That's Tracy, Tracey, @camera.org, tracy@camera.org. Then on June 4th, we're having a very interesting panel of camera analysts discussing the New York Times' coverage of Israel. And we'll be sending notices for all these events, and I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, I wish you all good health and a good day. Thank you again for tuning in, everyone.